everyone, and welcome to School Psych Chat's GASP Edition, the podcast dedicated to all things school psychology in the great state of Georgia. Let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to School Psych Chat's GASP Edition. I'm your host, Kylah Pollard, and I am bringing this podcast to you on behalf of the Georgia Association of School Psychologists, or GASP, as we like to call them. GASP is a professional organization representing school psychologists in the state of Georgia. It serves as a resource and advocate for its members, promoting the field of school psychology and supporting the well-being and academic success of students. So let's get started. The GASP Advocacy Committee is hosting their annual Capitol Day in February at the Georgia State Capitol, and we've added the registration link to the show notes if you would like to participate. To help everyone prepare for it, we are continuing our discussion of the basics of advocacy. Today, we are discussing the legislative process in the state of Georgia. To help us with this discussion, please welcome GASP President-Elect Brannon Parks and Margaret Ciccarelli.
I grew up in Statesboro, Georgia, have a degree from Statesboro High School, have my undergrad from UGA, and then went on to Mercer Law School. I've been in Page for about 20 years and live in Decatur and have 3 kids in Georgia public schools.
We'll be discussing the legislative process in the state of Georgia. Now, we've all seen the Schoolhouse Rock videos about how a bill becomes a law and the 3 branches of government. Those videos give a quick description of how the federal government is set up, so I'll just give a quick explanation just as a reminder for everyone. The federal government is made of 3 branches: judicial, executive, and legislative. The judicial branch is made of the court system, and the executive branch includes the president. The legislative branch is kind of where our focus is right now for the purposes of this discussion. And it's made of 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. These people are elected by the individuals in their designated areas. Georgia has 14 federal representatives and 2 federal senators. The legislative session lasts for a year, and our representatives work full-time as congressmen during their terms. The legislative branch has many different powers, including determining taxes, declaring war, regulating trade and commerce, and making other laws that are deemed necessary and proper for our society. Now, onto a bill becoming a law. A bill starts as an idea, is drafted into legal language. It's introduced in either the House or the Senate, then assigned to a committee for review, hearings, and possible amendments. If approved, it goes to the full chamber for debate and a vote. If passed by one chamber, it repeats the process in the other. If versions differ, a conference committee creates a compromise. This version is voted on again by both chambers. Finally, it goes to the president. So that's kind of how the federal process is set up. Could y'all talk about how the legislative process works here in Georgia and how it differs from the federal process?
Margaret, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Brannon. One of the main ways Georgia differs from the federal process, which I don't have extensive, firsthand professional experience with, other than monitoring and sometimes weighing in on congressional pieces from a Georgia educator perspective, is that the Georgia legislature is much more condensed in duration. We meet for 40 legislative days, which don't necessarily overlap with calendar days. In fact, breaking news here, an adjournment resolution has already been passed for the 2025 legislative session. We will sine die, according to this adjournment resolution, on Friday, April 4th. And we already have the crossover day date as well. Yeah, the condensation of the schedule is one of the most significant ways. Also, the characteristics of the legislators themselves. The Georgia legislature is intended to be kind of a part-time job for elected House and Senate members at the state level. And it's much more unusual for members of Congress in state delegations in DC to have part-time jobs or even full-time jobs that they are carrying on concurrently to serving in office.
No, I mean, Margaret, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. The main difference being, which I like that you put that out there is that these are part-time folks. They live amongst us. You see them at church, you see them at Walmart, you see them all over the community. Whereas your United States reps that are up in DC, unless they're holding town halls or something when they come back here, you rarely see them unless it's in the news, or Senator Warnock, Senator Ossoff now up in DC. You don't see those folks just in person, out and about in your community. Whereas in Georgia, whether it's your senator or your representative, they're much more accessible. And like Margaret said, once those 40 days are over, which breaking news, thank you, Margaret, because I was sitting here writing those dates down because I'm trying to plan a trip up there for another group. By the way, we are recording this on the first day of Georgia's legislative session. So that's why Margaret is at the Capitol right now. But they come back. They come back after those 40 days. A lot of them, especially down here in South Georgia where I am, they'll rent an apartment, they'll share an apartment or a townhouse or a condominium and come back and forth from Atlanta on the weekends. And that's really the main difference to me. The 40 days versus the full year, and plus being able to see your people pretty much not whenever you want to, but you just run into them around the community.
Okay, can you explain what the process looks like once a bill has a sponsor?
We are excited this year because we actually have a bill that has a sponsor. Jakimva Martin and I, who was on this previous podcast, is a school psychologist in Lawrence County. She's our advocacy chair for GASP. She and I met with Representative Bethany Ballard back in September to discuss a piece of legislation. And once we got her that model language, she talked it over with some other folks. And then this is where I'll let Margaret kind of jump in since she is a lawyer. The representative or senator takes it to what's called legislative council. And from my understanding, legislative council looks at the proposed legislation and figures out which codes of Georgia law that it may or may not impact, and then helps to craft that legislation to address those. But Margaret knows more about that than me, so I'll let her jump in.
I think one of the important things for listeners to understand is that GASP or PAGE, the organization that I work for, or individual Georgians cannot move a piece of legislation on their own. You must have a legislative sponsor who will then undergo the process that Brannon just articulated. So it's important to understand that if you have an idea that becomes a bill, like the I'm Just a Bill, fun schoolhouse rock icon that we all know and love, that you mentioned earlier, Kylah, it's important to take that idea to a legislator who can create an official piece of legislation that has an official bill number that will move through the legislative process. After a legislative council, it's read on the floor of the chamber that it starts in, either the House or the Senate, and then it goes to committee and maybe heard in committee at the committee's discretion. If it passes committee, it will go to a second committee called the Rules Committee that will schedule it, maybe, if it's a popular bill, for a floor vote in the Chamber of Origin. And then it will, after a floor vote, move to the other side, the other chamber, where it will undergo the same process. If a piece of legislation doesn't pass the Chamber of Origin, it's not completely dead. It's a little bit like a zombie. I'm sure we can picture a zombie movies in our heads and the fun that ensues with zombies. So legislation like that could potentially be tacked on to another bill that is successfully moving if the subject matter is even loosely similar. And you will hear bills like that referred to as Christmas trees. So the most important and usually successful way to get a bill moving is to have one sponsored on your behalf by a legislature. But not all hope is lost if that bill either doesn't happen or fails to move. You can try to find another vehicle to put your idea into.
Margaret, can I ask you a quick question? I don't know how I don't remember this, but so when it's read on the floor, is it who decides which committee it's assigned to?
the speaker in the House or the lieutenant governor in the Senate is part of the decision making, or the lead decision makers about what bills go to what committee. And there's also gamesmanship and strategy as in that decision making. Sometimes if a leader of the House or Senate does not think that a committee will be, a certain committee may be open to passing legislation, they might send it to a different committee if it's kind of loosely in the subject matter or the domain of that committee. I've seen that strategy used multiple times in the last 20 years.
Thank you.
Margaret, are there any bills relevant to school psychology that Paige is looking at this year?
Two major important ones. Number one, we don't have a bill number for the Interstate Compact for school psychs, but we were thrilled to work with GASP and NASP on introduction of the legislation. So we'll have a bill number, we hope, in the next days or weeks on the Interstate Compact. The other major thing to watch is the state budget, which is technically a bill itself. We have asked at Paige for more funding for school psychologists. We need a multi-pronged strategy in the state of Georgia to fund and create and license school psychologists. So one of the things that we have asked state leaders, budget leaders for, including the governor, is for more funding for school psychs. So when the initial budget proposal drops, which we expect will be later this week, we hope there will be some good news for school psychs in the budget.
Okay, so you've talked about crossover day. You've already mentioned it once. What is crossover day, and why is that an important date?
After crossover day, the Capitol is a lot less hectic when you go visit. That's my experience. And I'll let her tell you why.
And that's important. As I mentioned earlier, crossover day is the day by which the Capitol crowd thins out, and also legislation's got to pass one chamber by crossover to be eligible to pass the other chamber to become law, that legislative session. I mentioned the zombie bills, and there are some rules and ways around that. But for all practical purposes, a lot of legislation falls by the wayside when it doesn't make the crossover day deadline. This legislative session's crossover deadline is March 6th. So by March 7th, we should have a better idea of the legislative landscape and bills that are serious contenders to pass. Another thing that's really important for listeners to understand is there is a great deal of legislation that is introduced under the Gold Dome each year that never passes, even the chamber that it came from. So hopefully that won't be the case with the school psych interstate compact, which there are lots of groups, including GASP, NASP, and Paige pulling for. But just because a piece is introduced by a legislature doesn't mean it will move. You see that particularly with highly partisan, contentious, or kind of culturally outrageous legislation. Some of it gets through, but a lot of it doesn't.
So last week we talked about, in our last podcast, we talked about what GASP is asking for from legislators, or asks for advocacy this year. How can school psychologists help our state legislators?
One of the things that we even do sometimes as staff and with Paige members is that we practice the ask. We will look at each other, say what our advocacy ask is, and ask for feedback from the listener. Because it can feel very sometimes awkward or tense to get out a 30-second or 60-second elevator pitch in the chaos of the state capitol. So if you practice a few times with a good friend who knows the subject matter also and who you trust, you are going to rock it at the velvet ropes, which are what the ropes in front of the chambers are called, when you make a pitch to policymakers on GASP Day.
And so we talked last week about the elevator speech, but we talked about making it maybe about 2 minutes, and you're saying about 30 to 60 seconds. How do you suggest cutting down that elevator speech to get all of that information in?
What I do is to create a long form and a short form. I try to get the most essential part of the ask out in the beginning. And then if I have another 30 to 60 seconds with a legislator, I will start kind of filling in the gaps and maybe even quickly circle back to the main themes so that they understand the essential parts of the conversation or the ask. So again, like a super short, like it would fit on a bumper sticker, maybe a big bumper sticker, and then something designed for 60 to 120 seconds. And no, also, like sometimes that's in the elevator, sometimes it's in the ladies' room. We take these opportunities where we get them. And don't forget also, y'all described, part-time legislators and seeing them at Walmart, at church, or even in your own school. Those are great opportunities as well.
Yeah, I did have a conversation in the bathroom last year at Capitol Day. A lady stopped me and she's like, "Wait, which group are you with? Oh, what do they do?" And I'm like, "Well, let me wash my hands first and I'll happily explain."
Well done,
Okay.
Kylah. That's exactly the way.
Well, thank you. Okay, Brannon, was there anything you wanted to add to any of that?
You can talk to any legislator, and that's great. We'll have our buttons on. We'll be GASP school psychologists, but your legislator, like we spoke about last week or on the previous podcast, they know that you can vote for them or vote against them because you live in their district. You are a constituent. It's good to have that relationship with your personal representative and your personal senator. If, like you, Kyle, I believe you have a representative where you work, but then you have a different one where you live. I'm in a unique situation with Arisa where I work, where there are, well, discounting Muskogee County, there's still 4 different representatives that represent the counties that we serve with school psychological services. And then I have my personal representative that I'm in their district. And I try to make sure I have a cordial relationship with all 5 of those, and they know who I am and what it is that I do. But like Margaret said, and like you encountered last year in the ladies' room, take the opportunity when it's given. If there's somebody you're not sure, but they have all right, Margaret, help me with this. Senators are a blue badge and representatives are a red badge, right?
That is how it's traditionally been, although from time to time they do switch it up. So I haven't seen any name badges this year yet, but I think we're still blue Senate, red House last time I checked. But I've only seen House members today, so maybe the Senate has purple or polka dot. We'll see. Probably not. Probably still blue.
You never know. We could have, sparkles this year or glitter or something. There's still time.
That would certainly make let's hang up a disco ball in the Senate chambers. There's still time. We can have fun with it.
And then Margaret might have mentioned this as well. She alluded to the ropes and the way that, yes, you can just go stand by the ropes, but there's an actual way if you want to call somebody out of one of the chambers. You send a note in. If any of you happen to be pages back in the day, pages take your note into the House or the Senate with your name on it, who you are, why you would like to see the person. So that's the way that you don't just go stand there and say, "Hey, I want to see this person. Can you go in and get them for me?" There's a formal way to go about it while we're there.
Yeah, you're sending a middle school or high school student who's volunteering to run in and carry your note to the House or have that to the House or Senate chamber, which is a lovely kind of throwback and analog to how it's been done for decades. I paged in just the same way when I was in middle school. I'm sure some listeners have as well. And I would add also that now some of us have children who are old enough to page. My oldest child paged last year, and that was a really wonderful experience. House Speaker John Burns's wife, Gail, who is a former lifelong educator, is now in charge of the PAGE program on the House side. And she was an absolute joy as a hostess in the PAGE program to my daughter. So if listeners would like their children who are ages, I think you have to be at least 12 to PAGE, although I'd recommend more in like the 14 range. But if you would like your child to PAGE in the House, or a student in the House or the Senate during the legislative session, reach out to your House or Senate member. They will sponsor your student or child to serve as a PAGE during the General Assembly. Each senator and House member only has a certain number of pages that they can bring during the General Assembly. But it's a great way for kids to understand how it works here, and to help adults as they're going through the advocacy process, as y'all will on GASP Day. And then finally, you never know when you might be back after becoming a PAGE, and you might work here full time.
And one other thing I wanted to mention about that, so the PAGE will take your note in, but then they come out. So make sure you know what the senator or the House member looks like. When they, if you've requested somebody, you can pull them up they have a headshot on there. So the most embarrassing thing is to be standing out there and you see a legislator or senator or representative looking up and down the ropes, and you're standing there and you're like, is that, you're far enough away where you can't see their name badge. You're like, is that who I've called out here? So just take a couple of seconds to look at their headshot on the House or Senate webpage.
Yeah, at legis.ga.gov, on either House or Senate drop-down menus, you can see photos and bios for all House and Senate members. And that is great to learn these faces as you work the velvet ropes, as we just described. And we have to do it too. Those of us who work full-time, we don't know all of the new House and Senate members. And as we get to know them during a 2-year biennium, we rely heavily on those headshots as well. So use that site as much as you need to.
Okay, how do I find out the details of a bill or a committee meeting?
Probably one of the best resources, shameless plug for my life's work, is the daily report from the Capitol on all things education related that PAGE puts out. So PAGE does a great report. The Georgia School Board is the only other major education organization that does a daily report. I always read both of those, and I have a pretty good idea of what education action happened at the Capitol from both of those reports. So definitely tune into those. I know that y'all put out legislative material at GASP, and readers need to pay attention to that as well. So in our reports, and probably GASP reports as well, you can click on a link to a bill and it will take you to look at the contents of the bill. You can see the preamble, who the speaker, who the sponsors are, where the sponsor is from, and read the substance of the bill. And then one of the important things that my association does is to also summarize in our daily reports kind of what the bill education legislation does. And we will track changes to the legislation as it moves through the process. So that's the important way to learn about or an important strategy to learn about what's in a bill. As for committee meetings, that can be tricky. It's gotten easier with technology and greater transparency here under the Gold Dome. So in our daily reports, we try, if they are scheduled by the time we write the report, we try to let viewers know, readers know about upcoming legislative meetings and what will be happening at those meetings. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is to go back to that website, which is again legis.ga.gov, which has an upcoming schedule section, and you can see, or if any committees that you're interested in are meeting. And then there's one final strategy that those of you who are real legislative junkies might consider, but is a free strategy, which is to look up who the House and Senate and any other education chairs and any other committees that you might be interested in, and to reach out to the administrative assistants for those committees and ask to be put on the distribution list. That is also a strategy that we utilize. There's a couple of other paid subscriptions as well that we use to make sure that we never miss a committee meeting, and also never forget word of mouth and getting by with a little help from your friends. These meetings, their times change, the agendas change, and sometimes that can happen 10 times in a day. So we rely on each other to better understand what might be heard in committee and to prepare for that.
How far in advance are committee meetings usually set?
Sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 5 minutes. I mean, I have had a committee meeting on a high profile bill scheduled on a Sunday night for 7 a.m. the next morning on a Monday. And I can't overstate like how how much that kind of wreaks havoc on the schedule of those of us, even those of us who have jobs where we're full-time assigned to the state capitol. We really have to watch the meetings schedules and utilize all the strategies I just articulated, as well as paid services, to try to make sure we know what's coming. Because again, some of the committees have a scheduled meeting time, and they'll meet weekly, but they're going to hold additional meetings, and they're going to be subcommittee meetings, and then there are going to be some last minute meetings to get through controversial legislation that they're hoping people will miss.
Margaret, can I bring a follow-up question there, because I can see some members asking this? Are there any legal, in other words, they're not breaking a law when they say at 10 o'clock in the morning, hey, we're going to hold this committee meeting at 2 o'clock this afternoon. There's no time, because, you know, in the education world, we're full of timelines, 60 days here, 10 days.
I'm sure that you are going to be shocked, Brannon and Kylah and listeners, to hear that the legislature has carved out some exceptions to open meetings and open records requirements to themselves. So yes, they are not bound by the same playbook that you are.
Yeah, there's nothing that says you have to announce this and it has to be published before you can hold this meeting.
I will say that there are some rules that the chambers set for themselves about notice before, as the legislation, as the biennium, and we're in a new biennium right now, a 2-year legislative session, as the biennium begins. And so they're supposed to, theoretically, abide by their own rules for their chamber that they kind of re-up routinely. They don't always do that though. So that's also kind of a procedural thing that we do sometimes try to utilize to try to get other legislators who might be friendly to whatever cause, you know, we're working on, to try to address that on procedural grounds.
And I guess that helps. One of my other follow-up questions was, I heard that legislators can have meetings up till 10 o'clock at night. They'll schedule things in the morning, they'll schedule it in the afternoon, and it's just kind of all over the place. But that also makes sense if there's not a good notice procedure that's always followed for meetings, and how hectic everything can be, especially before crossover day.
Oh yeah, the folks who are the biggest victims for this, other than kind of the general Georgia kind of citizens and transparency, the legislators themselves are really harried during the legislative session and trying really hard to make all their commitments, but it's a real challenge, which is why we need subject matter experts like you to develop those close relationships with legislators and to help them do their jobs better when it comes to education and mental health and other issues that school psychologists and GASP care about.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here today. Thank you, Margaret, for taking some time out of your hectic schedule today to talk to us. It has been a very informative conversation. Tune in next time, everyone, while we prepare for Capitol Day. Talk to you soon.
That's all for today's School Psych Chat. Thanks for listening. To keep the conversation going, follow us at GASP Online, and don't forget to like and subscribe this podcast. Talk to you next time.